This episode is brought to you by FX's The Veil, starring Elizabeth Moss. FX's The Veil is an international spy thriller that follows two women as they play a deadly game of truth and lies on the road from Istanbul to Paris and London. One woman has a secret, and the other has a mission to reveal it before thousands of lives are lost. FX's The Veil premieres April 30th, only on Hulu.
We all have that friend who wakes up early to go get everyone McDonald's breakfast, while the rest of us sleep in. This is your sign to thank them. And if you're that friend, this is us saying thank you.
Just a friendly reminder that right now, get any size iced coffee before 11 a.m. for just 99 cents. And a satisfying sausage McMuffin with egg is just $2.79. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
I knew that more plot was hidden in these science questions that I didn't understand. And, to know what happened in the book, I felt leaning into the reality of the research, leaning into the minutiae of the research, actually helped the emotional stakes and the emotional presence of the book.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, Ronald Young Jr.
And I'm your other host, Isaac Butler.
Isaac Butler, fancy meeting you here.
Ronald Young Jr.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Tell me, whose voice did we hear at the top of the show?
That was the voice of Julia Hannafin. And in a rare occurrence for Working, they will be joined by a second voice, Adam Rosenblatt.
Whoa, two guests. I like it. Is this a Working first? I'm new here.
We've done it occasionally. It's just a thing we do very rarely.
Okay, great. So I'll keep that in mind as I'm booking ahead. What brings two guests on at once, Isaac Butler?
So Julia Hannafin has a new book out with Great Place Books called Cascade. They describe it in depth later in the episode, so I'll let them do that. But needless to say, the events of the novel take place during a scientific expedition off the coast of California to tag the area's great white shark population. Or I guess I should say white shark population, because they've recently rebranded the great white shark as the white shark to avoid stigmatism. Anyway, to learn as much as possible about the science of these kinds of tagging trips and how they work, Julia worked with Adam, who is a scientist whose specialty field is marine apex predators. So since we always talk about research like all the friggin' time on this show, I thought this was an exciting opportunity to see the kind of artist research relationship in this richly detailed way.
I'm not going to lie, I have a lot of follow-up questions on dropping the word great from the white shark moniker.
I know.
I feel like that was doing the most appropriate amount of branding and work there.
Well, do you think they all got together with like a branding consultant? Like they hired a branding consultant like, so anyway, we were wondering how to appeal to the American public more. And they're like, what if you dropped great?
Shark accent aside, I am very excited to hear this interview, but I'm sure that you have more for our Slate Plus members. What do you have?
Indeed, I do. So Julia isn't just a novelist. They also have quite a bit of TV and screenwriting experience. So I wanted to ask them about that and how it relates to fiction, because the job processes, the way that writing works, they're really quite different.
Well, if you're a member of Slate Plus, you'll hear that at the end of the episode. And if you aren't, it's really easy to join. As a Slate Plus member, you get to hear extra segments on this show and others like the Culture Gab Fest and Care and Feeding, the parenting podcast formerly known as Mom and Dad Are Fighting. You'll also get bonus episodes of podcasts like Podcast of the Year, Slow Burn. And of course, you'll never hit a paywall on slate.com. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus. All right, let's hear Isaac Butler's conversation with Julia Hannafin and Adam Rosenblatt.
This episode of Working is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting and all you want to do is find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy. like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare. So it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Julia Hannafin and Adam Rosenblatt, thank you for being my guest today on Working to talk about your processes.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited to be here.
So let's just start with the most basic of questions. What do each of you do? Julia, how about you first?
So I'm a writer. I write novels as well as for TV and film.
And I am an ecologist, which is a kind of biologist. I study living things and how they interact with each other, animals and plants. And I'm a professor at the University of North Florida in the biology department.
Now, I think many of our listeners are probably wondering, why do we have a novelist and a zoologist on at the same time on this show? But it turns out that you were collaborators of sorts on Julia's novel Cascade, which your first novel. It's currently out from Great Place Books. Julia, can you tell us a little bit about Cascade, just what it's about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cascade is about a young woman, Lydia, who goes to work for her ex-boyfriend's father, who is a great white shark researcher on a remote set of islands after her mom passes away. She sort of loses herself in this new environment, and as unforeseen interactions between the animals start to happen on these islands, she starts to untangle her grief and the sort of baggage emotionally that she's bringing to the island.
Now, often novels don't start in the form or, with the idea that they end up in, right? So I write nonfiction, you figure it out in the proposal and then you sort of do it, right? It's a little bit different in fiction. Was it always going to be a novel about a grieving person in their late teens who ends up attracted to their ex-boyfriend's dad on a research trip, or was that something that evolved over time?
Definitely evolved over time. I am friends with my old high school poetry teacher, and she had me over for tea one day. A dear friend from her past told me a story about tagging elephant seals. And so I started writing about a researcher and about a young person who was interested in him. And then as I was writing, I realized that I was writing this sort of emotional intensity that I didn't know where it was coming from. And so I sort of had to travel backwards to figure out, she's coming from a loss. There's something in her family that happened that was, that is driving her to this place that she's at now.
And so at what point did you realize, to get this novel right, I have to find someone who researches apex marine predators?
Yeah, that sort of goes back to another change I had to make. I first wrote the book where they were researching seals, that seals was their sort of primary research target. And then
you felt seals didn't carry the emotional weight of grief.
Yes.
Is that really
that is correct, but I also made a science mistake. I had them tagging seals on a boat, which wouldn't make sense for the islands that they were in because it would require them to chum in the waters, which isn't allowed. That ended up informing a later plot point, that sort of mistake. But I heard from a friend about the Academy of Sciences, which will connect you to a scientist in the field that you need to know more about to sort of promote better depictions of science in creative work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's how I got connected to Adam.
Now, some people, they would just be like, well, I made a science mistake, but it's a work of fiction. So in this fictional version of the United States, it's legally okay to chum the waters around here. Who gives a shit? What to you was important about getting that sort of thing right?
I think because I had chosen chosen a place that, really exists, that I knew about growing up, the Farallones, which are it's a marine refuge, like about 30 miles outside of San Francisco. Part of me really wanted to be true to that setting that I had chosen. And then I think also I knew that more plot was hidden in these science questions that I didn't understand. And, to know what happened in the book, I felt sticking to the truth and learning from someone else would lead me there.
Got it. And so let's talk about the person who you learn from. Adam, you're a zoologist. You specialize in the interaction of, as your website says, predators, prey, and plants, the big 3 Ps in ecosystems. Just what drew you to that subject matter as a field?
I've just always been interested in large predators. That's really been my entryway into biology. From being a kid and watching nature documentaries with my mom on PBS. And, it's the drama, right? Like Julia's book, has all of this drama in it, but the natural world has so much drama in it from predators interacting with their prey. So that was kind of my initial entryway into biology. And then once you get into the actual dynamics of how these systems work and how these animals are behaving and thinking about each other and trying to make decisions, it just becomes endlessly more fascinating.
Do you feel like, you've been doing this for a long time. So, what to you have you kind of learned about the world even outside of your field of study from focusing on large predators and ecosystems?
I actually talk about this with my students a lot, that when you study other animals other than human beings, you realize the similarities we have between them and us, right? Mm-hmm. And I actually spend a lot of my time talking with students and talking with the general public, trying to convince people that we are not different from them, right? Like we are animals, and all of our behaviors, we think we're sort of above other animals, that we're more evolved or we're more advanced, and that's really not the case. Like everything we do, you can boil down to basic animal behaviors that apply to all creatures, right?
And I also have multiple rows of baby teeth that just replace the ones when they break off.
Yeah, exactly. Like we all go through different, sharks are replacing them throughout their lives, and we only do it once, but it's the same process fundamentally, right? And so I love the idea of being able to apply that knowledge and that information to a world like the one that Julia was creating.
It's interesting because it's almost like the reverse of anthropomorphism, right? Because the mistake a lot of us make, and it's a mistake that nonfiction writers make, that fiction writers make, that dramatists make, or whatever, right? Is the way to connect the human to the animal is to make the animal more like us. And what you're the challenge you're laying out, Adam, is that the way to make the human connect to the animal is to point out the ways the human is like the animal.
Yes, no, you've exactly hit it on the head. And I just wanted to call out the thing that Julia mentioned earlier before we get away from it too much. The name of the program that the National Academy of Sciences runs, just in case anybody's interested, is called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. And it's exactly what Julia described, where it matches up scientists with, creative types who are making, movies or books or whatever. And I've done a bunch of these projects, and it's always fun to sort of think about, how the work that I do can inform these more invented worlds that people are creating in their minds.
So, Julia, to back up to the kind of human and animal thing, did you think about that challenge while writing the novel of, the characters are going to anthropomorphize the animals because we all do that, but the novel doesn't necessarily want to do that, right? And that seems to me like a creative challenge.
Yes, definitely. And I do think that sort of flip that you're describing, that Adam embodies and how he talks to his students was, definitely impactful on me. Because I wanted there to be mistakes in reading too much into the animal's behavior, but I also wanted, like a theme of the book is sort of, having your parents be a mystery to you, having the way that your parents parented, successfully or not, being sort of nebulous. And that also translates to sharks, that we don't know about how white sharks give birth. We don't know much about how they parent. So to try to see that, but have it twisted back into the characters as opposed to just living in what we think of the animals was important to me.
Mm-hmm. Usually when we think about the creative process, and this is certainly true of this program, we're thinking about artists, writers, musicians, whatever, not researchers. But so I have to ask, Adam, do you consider your job creative? And what are the creative parts of that job?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would think traditionally, scientists of all different fields were not considered creatives, we were considered more just like observers, right, of the natural world and trying to extract some sort of knowledge or truth from that. But I, in my career at least, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but I think it's a very creative thing to do, to be a scientist, because you have to try to think about the world in a way that maybe hasn't been thought about before, think of an explanation for some phenomenon that hasn't been thought about before, and that requires these sometimes imaginative leaps. I mean, you just think about somebody like Albert Einstein, right? I mean, that's obviously a famous example, but, think about the creativity it takes to come up with the theory of relativity, right? Like this brand new idea for explaining how gravity works and how the universe works and how time works, right? And it's like, that's a fundamentally creative process, to me at least.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It seems that, another thing that science and the creative fields have in common that doesn't get discussed enough is mistakes or, going down paths that lead to dead ends, experiments that don't work out. You have a creative idea about how the world works, then you observe it and you realize you were wrong, but that gets you closer to another idea. That is a part of being a creative person that very much frustrates me. So I'm interested, Adam, in how you think about it. And, when an experiment goes awry or an observation disproves something you wrote, how you just sort of get back to it and how you've learned how to do that.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely the norm, exactly what you're describing. I mean, science is all about failure.
Right.
But the thing you learn quickly as a scientist is that you learn way more from your failures than you do from your successes, because it opens up a new question that you hadn't maybe thought about before, right? And that's an incredibly important and overlooked part of the scientific process, is failing and then trying to figure out why your experiment or observations deviate from what you thought would happen.
Is there an example of that you can tell us about, of a failure or an unexpected result that then opened up some new vista for you in your work?
Yeah, so I do research on alligators. I'm an alligator expert, which is a weird thing to say out loud, but
well, you are in Florida. I mean,
you're right. If you're going to be an alligator expert, I mean, it makes sense to be in Florida. You might expect that.
Yeah.
But so maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I started doing research on alligator eggs and how the eggs are responding to climate change. And the question that everybody had been asking in this community was, how is temperature going to impact the eggs? Because as temperatures increase, as climate change continues, there's concern that the babies that come out of the eggs will become more female than male. And that's because they have this temperature-dependent sex determination. It's in alligators, crocodiles, it's in sea turtles. There's a bunch of different species that have this kind of sex determination where the sex isn't determined genetically. It's determined just by the temperature of the nest, which is fascinating. So people were concerned, as the temperature increases, are alligator nests going to produce way more females than males than they should? And then is that going to change how they can reproduce and, how many new babies they get in the next generation? So that's what I started doing. I started doing experiments on temperature, and I realized as I was doing the experiments, I was getting these funky results. It didn't make any sense. And I realized after some, trial and error and talking to other folks and reading lots of literature, that the problem I was experiencing wasn't being caused by temperature, it was being caused by humidity, right? Like the humidity within the nest can also affect the development of the embryos. And so that took me off on this whole new research track where now I'm doing a bunch of humidity research, and I'm not really interested in temperature anymore because I think it's more fascinating.
That's you're blowing my mind here.
Wow.
So what was the collaboration actually like? Did you go to Florida to work with Adam, or was it like a bunch of Zoom meetings, or, what was the collaboration?
Yeah, it was a bunch of phone calls. At first I called, asked him a bunch of questions, took a bunch of notes. I was particularly interested in this prey interaction between orcas and white sharks. So he gave me some really good things to think about that. And then when I had a draft of the book, I kept having this feeling that I might have gotten something wrong. And, I had asked him to really be present in my research and in my, idea sort of development, but could I ask him to read the book as well? So he ended up reading the book, and then we talked about my draft. I made some changes from there. So, yeah, it would be very cool to get to see his research, in real life one day. But it was a lot of phone calls and using him as a reader as well.
And did you go along with anyone on a tagging trip or anything like that, or is that all sort of imagined out of the research you did?
That is all imagined, yeah. did a lot of reading. I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and I got to talk to Adam. Even being an alligator expert, he's gone on some shark tagging trips, so that was really helpful having him as an expert in that arena too. And then the closest I got to the islands was a whale watching trip that I took my girlfriend on. It was another sort of panicked moment in a draft where I thought, I haven't been to these islands. Is there some detail about them, sensorial or otherwise, that people will clock and say, and again, it's fiction to your earlier question. I'm not sure why I was so concerned, but going was great. You don't get to step onto the islands because it's protected, but you get pretty close, 30 feet or so. And it really felt like the place that I had been living in my mind, which was a very surreal and vivid experience.
Is that where you figured out that it's just covered in bird shit?
I had heard that it was covered in bird shit, but the scale and the extent of the smell was was intense.
Yeah. Can you talk about a specific piece of research that was provided that was like really generative and inspiring? Because I'm always telling students, the reason why you do research actually is to get ideas. That's the main thing, right? It's fuel. It's like, I know you don't want to go to the library or on JSTOR or whatever, but you'll get ideas out of it. That's why you do it.
Yeah. I think just all the research that, I was able to do on how dramatically impacted white sharks are when an orca visits the Farallones, in particular, like that an orca could even come within a certain distance of the Farallones, not even have an attack on the shark. The sharks would flee thousands of miles, within a few hours. And even these animals that we think of as these apex predators, so scary.
What's the best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day in everyday situations. But if that's not on the cards this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. I've used apps in the past to learn new languages, but when I came across Babbel, I wondered if it could help me refresh my knowledge of a language I once spoke well, but was now a little bit or quite a lot rusty. I have to say, I was impressed. The advanced lessons were really useful, tips and idioms that can help with in-depth conversations on topics that I can actually imagine chatting about. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations, and the tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. What's more, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for working listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for working listeners at babbel.com/working. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/working, spelled BABBEL.com/working. Rules and restrictions may apply. Apple Card is the perfect cashback rewards credit card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase every day. That's 3% on your favorite products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. Every other Thursday on Working Overtime, we offer advice on how to get creative work done. So please tell us your challenges and let us help you. Drop us a line at working@slate.com. You can also send a voice memo to that same address or give us a ring at 304-933-WORK. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Working wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's return to Isaac Butler's conversation with Julia Hannafin and Adam Rosenblatt.
One interesting craft challenge for the book, it seems to me, is the level of minutia that you go into about what you actually do to tag these sharks and everything like that, right? Like one could imagine a writer being like, we spent the day tagging sharks that night, and then it just cuts to them at dinner or whatever, right?
Right.
Instead, you really go into a kind of micro detail about how you do that. Can you talk about that choice and why that choice felt necessary for the book?
I think I wanted, because Lydia is a character that's coming from this loss and is in this real state of emotional avoidance, not wanting to feel the impact of her mother's death, I think that her sort of intense presence on the island to everything that's real there, the minutiae of the research, the sensations of being there, that felt really important to me. Like she's trying to go into an experience so thoroughly that she forgets everything that came before. So I think that leaning into the reality of the research, leaning into the minutiae of the research actually helped the emotional stakes and the emotional presence of the book.
Just to add to that, I just wanted to say that, having done this research myself on sharks and alligators and lots of these big, potentially dangerous animals, like it's a fundamentally intense experience, right? Like all of your senses are sharpened and you're hyper-focused, and it's just what happens. And I think Julia including all that detail, it's important for the character, right? For Lydia to be having these sort of intense experiences because it's sort of adding to her state of mind, right? And by going into the minutia, like you're really taking the reader there as well, right? So I think, it was important from that respect as well. And I appreciate that Julia put in all these details and wanted to get them right.
Mm-hmm. So Julia, I read a thing online where you talked about writing about characters who are experiencing things before they have the language to articulate what they're going through. Or as you put it, because maybe that's a bad paraphrase, but you put it, a sensation before it becomes unknowing, which I loved that phrase. I thought that was really great. I'm just wondering on a technical level, like, how do you do that?
I think that, I know that the present tense and the first person present tense is a polarizing choice. Some people don't like that in fiction, but I think
I am often a disliker of that in fiction, I will admit. I was persuaded in this book, but when I opened it, I did have this moment where it's like, oh no, first person present tense. What's going to happen here? But it's a very specific, like the reason why I dislike it is that it's so often used just to goose stakes in a way that does not feel thoughtful. Whereas in this book, it feels necessary that it be written in first person present, if that makes sense.
Yes.
As somebody who's not a fiction writer, can you give me an example of first person present tense so I know what it is?
Yeah.
Yes.
I walk in the door and sit down. I am about to get on a Zoom to talk to Adam Rosenblatt and Julia Hannafin. Yeah, that as opposed to I walked in the door and sat down to get ready for my interview with Adam Rosenblatt and Julia Hannafin.
Because that would be first person past tense.
First person past, yeah.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And at least to me, the interesting challenges, and Julia, you could speak about this too, about those two different voices. In first person present, how do you deal with all the sensory input coming in and everything coming in so that it has like a shape? And in first person past, it's that, the narrator actually already knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the sensation before it becomes a knowing, I find the present tense really helpful with that, because you have a sort of in the moment narrativizing going on, but you don't have a larger perspective. You don't have now that I'm looking at my day, I know that this was the most important part, or now that I can see a pattern of behavior, I know that was what was going on. Like you just have in the moment. And I think that as humans, we're not great at really seeing ourselves clearly in the moment. I definitely think Lydia's not great at seeing herself clearly in the moment. And so I think the sort of minutia, the physical sensations, the present tense, living there, it allows the knowing to come later because it has to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm a real defender of it in certain cases.
Right.
Yeah.
If the protagonist has a certain blinkeredness to them or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, one thing that strikes me here is that there is some connection of this idea, sensation before it becomes a knowing, to the scientific process, right? Because the sensation or data you get comes prior to you having any understanding of that information. At least, look, my dad's a physicist, right? He used to work for NASA. He's retired now. But like, it seems to me that's sort of like how he talked about his own work in some way. Adam, am I totally off base here?
No, I think that's true. I think that's a good description of it, because I feel like it can work that way where you have an idea or you think you understand how the world works, right? But then as a scientist, you have to gather the data to actually demonstrate that that is real, that your sort of supposed understanding is actually real.
I mean, it seems to me like there's a habit of mind there of not jumping to conclusions. You know what I mean? Like, you might start with a conclusion and try to prove it, but you also know you might be fucked and it might turn out to be something completely different. So I'm curious about how you practice that habit of mind. Was that something you had to learn how to do, or were you always someone who didn't put the cart before the horse, Adam?
That's a good question. Have I always been that way, or did I mean, I definitely trained in that way. I mean, that's what becoming a scientist is, and just, approaching every kind of question with that sort of humility. I should say, if you're a good scientist, right? I mean, there's obviously scientists who kind of, do it the wrong way, right? But if you're a good scientist, you're trying to come into whatever question you're asking without too many preconceived notions, without trying to bias your data and bias your data collection. You're trying to be as, objective as possible. But yeah, I feel like I've probably always, just my personality, I think I've always kind of been that way. I come from a very logic-based family. My parents are both lawyers. So there's a lot of, I feel like there was a lot of that kind of talk and so that kind of attitude around the dinner table. And so maybe I was just brought up that way.
Right. Although the law, often you're trying to figure out a way to get to the answer you want.
That's true. No, that's a great point. And actually, that's the reason I went into science in the first place, is because my parents had such mastery over that part of, knowledge, like the legal knowledge and history and all that stuff. And I was like, I didn't consciously do this. When I was a kid, I realized now looking back that I was like, what can I study or do with my life that my parents won't know everything about? That I can be the expert in, right? And so I think that's what drew me to science, because nobody in my family is scientist.
Got it. That's amazing. Do you feel a relationship between that idea, Julia, of not knowing what you're getting when you get into it in the process of writing? This is my way of asking my co-host June Thomas's favorite question. Are you a plotter or a pantser? Are you someone who goes by the seat of your pants, or do you outline and plot out in advance?
Oh, a plotter or a pantser. Love it.
Yeah.
I'm perhaps unfortunately a pantser, and then I have to stop and go, where am I going? What have I built? What am I looking at? So I really related to, how you and Adam were describing the scientific process. It feels like remarkably connected to the creative process, in terms of, you think you've got one kind of story, you go off on that, for me, right, I'm just going down the road on the seat of my pants. And then I have all these questions that I didn't know I had. I have all these questions I don't know how to answer. And I have to really realistically look at, am I writing the book that I thought I was writing? And this book that I have in front of me, what does it need next? So I love, the alligator egg research and totally shifting gears to humidity from temperature. It's like I think that there are parallels to that in the creative process.
Yeah, totally. Now, obviously, Julia, you learned a lot from this creative, research partnership. Adam, you've done a number of these now. Do you learn things about how to do science from working with artists?
Ooh. Yeah, so I've worked with Julia. I worked with a guy who was writing a screenplay that was like a horror movie, and he wanted it to, just wanted ideas about how his monster could kind of be informed by how animals actually behave. And then there was another one that was writing about writing a TV series about alligators on drugs.
Cocaine alligators?
It was meth gators.
Meth gators.
Oh my God. I don't think it ever got made, because I've never heard about it, but it was a fascinating experience to talk to this guy for an hour about how would alligators actually behave if they were on methamphetamine.
Wait. Let us pause our very thoughtful discussion of the creative process, because you got to fucking tell me, how would alligators act if they were on methamphetamine?
So I'm trying to remember the details of the conversation. And I should say, this was based in his idea for this TV show was based in a real event where, I don't know, you two probably never heard about this, but it was all the rage in the alligator world. But maybe 6 years ago or maybe 8 years ago, there was this story out of Tennessee where a drug dealer was getting chased by the police, and he dumped his methamphetamines in it was like crystal meth, and he dumped it in a local river, right? Because he wanted to get rid of the evidence. And once this story got out there, people were like, wait, there's alligators in that river. Like, are they going to get high on meth, and like, what's going to happen to them? So that was it was a real event. And then this guy wanted to make it into like an entire show. And even though, so just to, you know, dispel anybody's concerns about this, you know, crystal meth being dissolved in a river, like it's such a low quantity, right? Like there's no way it would really affect the alligators at all, because it would be diluted, right? So much.
Right.
But yeah, so if I'm trying to remember the details of the conversation, it was like, if they got on methamphetamine, what the TV writer was trying to say was that they would become like hyper aggressive, and that they would go on like a killing spree. And that was kind of like the you know, drama of the show that he was writing. Right. And I was trying to, you know, I'm all in favor of like, you know, taking liberties, obviously, but I think I had to tell him that probably would not be the way that methamphetamine would work on alligators, just because they're so different from us. You know, they haven't shared a common ancestor with human beings for, I don't know, 300 million years, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like their physiology and our physiology has diverged for such a long period of time that there's no guarantee that the way that methamphetamine impacts us would impact an alligator in the same way.
I gotta say, I'm slightly disappointed you didn't design an experiment of dosing alligators with methamphetamine just to test, you know, just to give it your all for art, Adam.
Nobody would give me a permit for that kind of experiment, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that would be incredible. Question we ask a lot on this show is about being creatively blocked and how you get past it. And so, Julia, just want to know, I know that this had a kind of long gestation. Didn't some of it start maybe even way back in undergrad or something like that? I'm just wondering about how you get past being stuck.
I mean, I think having, a common writer answer, I think, is to have two projects and use one to procrastinate on the other. I'm a big fan of that. Making something that shouldn't be fun because it's at least not the other thing that I'm stuck on. I think research can help because I can find some detail from the real world that I couldn't have thought of myself, and that can inject it with a new sort of life. Yeah, putting it down. Having, thoughtful friends read into it and, again, sort of show me something that I couldn't see.
Mm-hmm. Adam, is there a scientist version of writer's block? Do you get creatively blocked as a scientist?
Yeah, definitely. And I was thinking about this as Julia was answering, and I feel like it's similar to something she described earlier, where she was talking about how she had to go. I mean, not that she was blocked in her writing process, but she felt that she had to go to the Farallons, right? To like actually be there in the environment, see it, and that was going to give, more realism to the writing, right? And I think it's similar in science, at least it has been for me, that if I'm feeling blocked on a particular question, I actually have to get out into the system that I'm thinking about, right? Because actually physically being there and smelling it and hearing it and seeing it in the flesh is usually will sort of instigate some new thinking about it. Like I was thinking about for my PhD, I had never worked with alligators before. And I was thinking about how I was going to approach this question. I was going to work with them in the Everglades. And my advisor, he was like, well, let's just go out and catch some alligators and see what happens, right? And I was like, okay, I guess that's what we're going to do. So like, about a month into my PhD, I'm out in the middle of nowhere in the Everglades, like catching alligators with my bare hands. And like that really, like, if you can't come up with ideas after that, then there's something wrong with you.
Right. Or you might just not have hands. I mean, that might be part of the challenge.
That's true.
Adam Rosenblatt, Julia Hannafin, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your process here on Working.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
Thanks for having us.
Up next, Isaac Butler and I will talk more about collaboration, the scientific method, and why I have some qualms about the first person present tense. Stay with us.
This episode is brought to you by Wondery. With the launch of ChatGPT, Sam Altman and OpenAI reinvigorated our fears of a world with artificial intelligence. While the company looked like a stunning success from the outside, a battle was brewing within on what the future of AI should be. Almost a year after launching ChatGPT, that battle erupted into a war when the company fired its charismatic CEO, Sam Altman. From Wondery, Business Wars is a podcast about the biggest corporate rivalries of all time. In the newest season, host David Brown digs into the philosophical differences within OpenAI that culminated in Sam Altman's shocking firing, the chaos that followed, and what it means for the future and safety of AI in the modern world. Follow Business Wars on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. And for more deep dive and daily podcast content, listen on Wondery, the destination for business podcasts. With shows like How I Built This, Business Wars, the best one yet, Business Movers, and many more, Wondery means business.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you're driving, cooking, or doing laundry, Progressive knows the podcasts you listen to go best when they're bundled with another activity, much like how their Progressive home and auto policies go best when they're bundled. Having these two policies together makes taking care of your insurance easier and could help you save too. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. That's a whole lot of savings and protection for your favorite podcast listening activities, like going on a road trip, cooking dinner, and even hitting the gym. Yep, your home and your car are even easier to protect when you bundle your insurance together. Find your perfect combo. Get a home and car insurance quote at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
Isaac Butler. So recently, you and I talked about collaboration, the do's and don'ts, logistically and creatively. And maybe a little bit we touched on what it actually means to have someone fill in the gaps where you're weak. But this type of research and commitment to depicting the real world aspects of a fictional story is something that we don't always see. What do you think of this type of collaboration where we're bringing in a literal expert to fill in the parts of stories that we don't necessarily want to imagine as a storyteller?
Well, from talking to friends who work in TV and film, this sort of thing is actually very common in a writer's room, that if there's some piece of specialist knowledge you need, you just go and you pay someone to come visit you and give a talk about it, Mm-hmm. But you hear about that a lot less with novelists, in part because who has the money. I feel in general, though, that regardless of what art you're working in, research is there to help you. It's the solid ground beneath your feet that then lets you depart and make your art. And when you're writing a fictional work from scratch, regardless of the medium, you're stumbling around in the dark, right? Like literally anything could happen on the page. All you have to do is write it. The sharks could suddenly grow legs and start eating the characters in the book halfway through. That doesn't happen, but I'm just saying, fiction, anything can happen. Mm-hmm. And so it's just helpful to have that kind of like grounding, especially because if you're setting your work within a specific milieu, learning and experiencing that world is just there to give you all sorts of things to inspire you and also to create kind of rules and guidelines. It's not like, I'm giving an example of when this goes wrong, I think, is, few things annoy me as much as those riffs that Neil deGrasse Tyson does about science fiction movies. You know what I'm talking about? Where he's like, well, actually, the gravity on that planet would have done this. And it wouldn't have. It's like, I just think it's anti-art and joyless. Yeah. It's like, that's joyless. Whereas this is about knowing the facts so you can use them to bring the world to life in a more vivid way. And frankly, I think it's wonderful that the grants like this exist so that writers can get out there and get that knowledge.
Yeah, I think there has to be a little bit of both, like a dose of reality.
Yeah.
But still let me have some creative and poetic license to like make the story that I actually want to make.
I want to see BB-8 hover over that sand. It's okay if that's not real.
That's fine.
Let's just do it.
Let's do it. Like, who cares?
There's the Force in this universe. Who cares?
Now, y'all started to get into a bit, but I wanted to revisit the part where you specifically talked about how the creativity of researchers informs the scientific method. And Adam talks about shifting his research on alligators from temperature to humidity specifically. I think oftentimes in the information age of today, a lot of folks' research is limited to one Google search that either confirms or disproves what they were thinking, and then it stops right there. How important would you say this extra step of pushing forward and continuing the research is? And why do you think researchers and scientists have to be creative in order to continue the path of discovery?
I'm so happy you picked up on that story because it totally blew my mind when he was talking about it. I was like, this is so cool. Yeah. This is so cool. I think that in the making of art, including nonfiction, you can research something to death in the hopes of getting everything 100% unimpeachably right. And if you're someone like me who enjoys the research process, that's a real trap, because it really is much safer to spend all day reading what other people have learned about something than going out there and committing your own ideas to paper, putting them out in the world, taking that risk. So it's very seductive. But you're right. On the other side of that are the people who do, they do a few cursory Google searches, or they look on Wikipedia until they find something that confirms whatever they already believe, and then they write about it. And that leads to really sloppy work. And I'll be honest, I think readers and viewers can tell when you haven't done your homework.
Yes.
When you are bullshitting and you don't really know what you're talking about, they can tell. You have to go deep. You have to know more than your audience about the subject that you are talking about. And also, as Adam discussed, the other part of that is that you discover new things that you don't know, and that will totally change the whole project. I think that's actually one of the things that can be scary about research, but actually if you embrace that, that's one of the beauties of it, because what is great about that is that the energy and joy of discovery, I think, can give you fuel and is palpable to the audience when they are experiencing your work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, again, we've come back to the same place of talking about balance from before, where we're saying like you want a little bit of both. But yes, I think we don't think about how much our listeners, viewers, and readers like can tell when we're just making it up as we go along.
Totally. And, you can overdo it. I mean, I've definitely had like freelancing assignments where, I've pitched a piece and they're going to accept it. I'm like, great, now I'm going to read these 6 books and then write it. I'm like, what am I talking about?
Yeah.
It is due in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to read 6 books, but there's stuff I can do to become enough of an authority to like, let me write it.
Exactly. Maybe listen to 6 podcast episodes.
6 podcast episodes. Yeah. I mean, the podcasting field, and I say this as a podcaster, the podcasting field, the like only doing cursory research and then acting like an authority is absolutely an epidemic,
Yes.
I think, in the podcast field, and something that all of us need to be really, really careful about, where it's like, well, I read one article in the New York Times about this, and now here's my 6-part podcast on it. It's like, do your homework.
Do some research. Get an editor. Isaac,
exactly.
Speaking of things that I hate the first person present tense. I despise it. I feel like it makes me feel uneasy because even the narrator has no idea about what's about to happen next. I need someone to be surviving the story, telling me how everything's going to be okay. So I find this tense very unsettling. However, y'all were making some very convincing points about why it worked particularly well for this book. Outside of the ideas that Julia was talking about with regard to noticing a pattern of behavior, staying in the moment, and allowing the knowing to come later, which would work in a book that involves these types of scientists doing research, can you think of other ways it might be useful in storytelling?
I'm glad that you centered in on that as well, because I asked that question because of my own knee-jerk dislike of the first person present. I mean, when I first cracked Cascade to read this, I was immediately suspicious because it's a young protagonist and it's in the first person present, and that often is a kind of like signal that the book is going to be kind of shallow, honestly, and that wasn't the case with Cascade, which is why I wanted to ask Julia about it. I think it has some uses. One of them is actually making the reader uncomfortable in the very way that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I think that's why first person present shows up constantly in horror fiction. Often I actually think they should just write it in third person past instead, like, because then you can still have the risk that the character will die. But each different subcategory of point of view and voice has its own pluses and minuses. And I think if you have someone who is experiencing things really immediately, and then that's in counterpoint with something they're reflecting upon, first person present for the former can work really well, and then you use first person past or whatever for the latter. And if your narrator is kind of blinkered and self-obsessed, a little myopic, and they're just kind of things are getting thrown at them and they're like, oh, what's going on? I'm gonna experience this world, then it can work well. Ishiguro does that a couple times, and it's really effective. I think the problem when it doesn't work is when you're actually just doing it to juice the piece of writing to make it feel more alive and more exciting. And it's like, actually what you need to do is go back in and make the sentences better. That's what's going to do that. The converting it to first person present is not going to solve that problem for you.
Lightning round.
Yeah.
I'm bringing a new segment to working.
I like this. It's a new segment called the Lightning Round.
Favorite shark, fictional or real? Go.
All right. I have always loved hammerhead sharks because they look so ridiculous, even though they're incredibly deadly. And of course, let's be honest, because of Bludgeon in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles,
Good
right?
choice. Good choice.
In terms of completely fictional sharks, I love the Shark AA group in Finding Nemo, the ones who are trying to never eat fish.
Good choice.
Right then. The meeting has officially come to order. Let us all say the pledge. I now am a shark, not a mindless eating machine. If I am to change this image, I must first change myself. Fish are friends, not food.
It's such a delightful little twist. You know, they end up in that world. You see these giant sharks. They're really scary. And then it turns out they are having an AA meeting. I just think it's so funny. It's actually my favorite part about that movie. I'm going to turn this around on you. Favorite sharks, real and fictional. Go.
Shark Bites fruit snacks. They were a delicious little snack that we ate in the 90s. They're my favorite sharks.
All right. That's good. You heard it here first. Bring back Shark Bites fruit snacks.
And that's all the time we have for this week. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Then you'll never miss an episode. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Slow Burn, and you'll never get a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus.
Thanks to Julia Hannafin and Adam Rosenblatt, our guests, and to our wonderful producer, the great white shark of producers, Cameron Drews. We'll be back next week with Ronald Young Jr.'s conversation with Anna Sale, host of the beloved Death, Sex, and Money podcast, which is now part of the Slate podcasting family. Woohoo! Until then, get back to work.
On Death, Sex, and Money, we feature interviews with you, our community of listeners, getting honest about uncomfortable things.
I developed an illness where it isn't safe for me to drive. A friend once said to me, sex is like air. You don't think about it until you're not getting enough. This is a similar sort of thing if you just replace sex with driving.
Listen to Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
Hello, listener. Dahlia Lithwick here, host of Amicus, that's Slate's podcast on the courts and the law and democracy and the rule of law. This May, our team will be publishing a special project that we are calling How Originalism Ate the Law. This neutral and academic-sounding methodology of looking at the law is, in fact, anything but neutral. Originalism is to the conservative legal movement what peanut butter is to jelly. As we're going to show you over the course of this project, originalism has been both cover and calling for conservative justices and judges to radically overhaul the lives of millions of Americans. And while they claim to be the apolitical interpreters of the Constitution and its author's intents, they have overturned Roe, radically expanded gun rights, and eviscerated voting rights. Across Slate.com and the Amicus podcast, we're going to be tackling questions like, where did originalism come from? Why has it taken over? Are progressive originalists really a thing? And am I allowed to have an opinion on originalism? Spoiler, the answer to that last question, you are. To celebrate the launch of this big project, we are running a special 2-week-long free trial of Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts. As a member, you'll get exclusive episodes from How Originalism Ate the Law, plus ad-free listening to all of your favorite Slate podcasts. Join now by clicking Try Free at the top of the Amicus show page or visit slate.com/Amicus Plus to get access wherever you listen.